All right. Welcome back. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right thing here. There we go. All right, so welcome back to U.S. History Lecture videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. So we just finished our Progressive Era Reform focus lecture. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Progressive Era in the White House, in politics, and specifically some presidents. So we're moving into the early 1900s, and we see this shift from sort of corrupt and effective politicians to progressive presidents that are able to effect change. How did this happen? Well, President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901 in New York, and that launched his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, unexpectedly into the presidency, becoming the youngest president in U.S. history. This accident changed the course of American politics for the entire 20th century. Republican leaders had actually hoped to kind of get rid of Roosevelt by making him the vice president, but fate had other plans, right? So an unexpected event can change the direction of a whole nation. Theodore Roosevelt takes charge as president, strong as a bull. Roosevelt became known as the Trust Buster. He made eliminating business trusts his main goal as president. He also created the Department of Commerce and Labor to investigate trusts. He launched his first antitrust suit in 1902, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor in 1904. President Roosevelt went on to file over 24 successful antitrust suits, more than any president before him. So he's targeting these major companies that are potentially corrupt and have a lot of power. For example, Standard Oil or the American tobacco companies. So these companies that are kind of having monopolies. So good trust versus bad trust, right? The president did not believe that all trusts were harmful to the public. Good trusts could use their size to deliver products cheaply to customers, but bad trusts were exploiting their power for short-term profit. Roosevelt allowed J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel Corporation to continue operating. And he was known for using the presidency as a bully pulpit to publicly denounce bad trust before taking legal action. Right? So we're talking about bad business practices, kind of these big businesses when we're talking about trust here. Roosevelt played a prominent role in labor disputes. There was a coal strike in 1902. And Roosevelt directly intervened by inviting both sides to the White House, right? So this is a big shift, a president that's like really stepping in and trying to deal with the issues that were happening in America. That had not happened for quite some time. The president negotiated a deal that included wage increases and better working hours. And this showed that Roosevelt believed the federal government should actively protect all Americans. And this was a big change, right? A lot of the progressive reform movements were put into place because people felt like the government wasn't doing its job. And we see now the government starting to step up. In the past, previous presidents had actually sent troops to support business owners against workers. So Roosevelt's approach of meeting in the middle and negotiating wage increases and better working hours was revolutionary at the time. Roosevelt won re-election in 1904 with 57% of the popular vote, and he created a progressive program called the Square Deal for all American people, focusing on democracy, efficiency, and social justice. So you can see these are the same themes as the progressive era kind of movement. Roosevelt believed that federal government should regulate big business and protect workers. And this was a big change in how Americans viewed the role of government and how the role of government actually affected change. So things like food safety and public health were brought to the president's attention. Upton Sinclair wrote a famous novel called The Jungle, which exposed conditions in meatpacking plants. The president pushed Congress to pass the meat inspection as a result of that, along with the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required government inspection of meat and labels on all food and drug products. The author was actually disappointed because he wanted to help workers, not just improve food quality. But food quality is important as well. Roosevelt was also an outdoorsman who loved nature, and he was very big into conservation and protecting chunks of land. He's quite famous for establishing 18 national monuments, 51 federal bird preserves, and 5 national parks. During his presidency, he conserved over 230 million acres of public land. So Roosevelt believed in preserving nature while allowing regulated public use. All right. William handpicked Secretary of War William Howard Taft as his successor. Right, he served his 2 terms, so someone else had to become president. Taft had experience as a governor of the Philippines and as the judge, and continued Roosevelt's policies. I mean, he was supposed to continue Roosevelt's policies, but Taft was not quite as skilled politically as Roosevelt was, and so he was less effective. He initiated twice as many antitrust suits as Roosevelt, but received little credit, and ultimately was not quite as successful. He had some challenges and some failures. He endorsed the Payne-Aldrich Act, which raised tariffs instead of lowering them, which angered the progressive Republicans. But his biggest mistake involved land conservation. His Secretary of the Interior approved selling millions of acres of federal land. And then when people objected, they got fired. So this widened the gap between Taft and Roosevelt, who felt quite betrayed after all the work he had done to protect federal land. So that brings us to the election of 1912. Angry at being denied the Republican nomination, Roosevelt formed the Progressive Party. He survived an assassination attempt during the campaign and famously said it'll take more than a bullet to kill a moose. And for the first time in history, a former president ran against an incumbent president. But this vote split, which actually helped the third candidate, Woodrow Wilson. Or I should say, let me put it, the split Republican vote between the current president and Roosevelt, that split the Republican vote, which means neither Republican candidate got as many votes as the Democratic candidate, and the Democratic candidate won the presidency. All right. So President Wilson's first priority was lowering tariffs. He passed the Revenue Act of 1913, reducing tariffs, which is, remember, taxes on foreign goods, by 15%. To replace that lost revenue, he reinstated the federal income tax. The Federal Reserve removed control of interest rates from private bankers, and so now the Federal Reserve could lower interest rates during recessions to encourage borrowing and help the economy. And they could also raise interest rates to prevent inflation. This still happens today. Still in effect today. And you can imagine that controlling interest rates can help during economic struggles, right? So put a little bit more power back into the hands of the national government, which people had mixed feelings about. In 1914, President Wilson passed the Clayton Antitrust Act to strengthen antitrust laws. He also passed the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act to protect children. The Federal Farm Act provided low-interest loans to farmers. And the Adamson Act established the first federally mandated 8-hour workday for railroad workers. So lots of reform happening here. By the election of 1916, Wilson needed to win over voters who had not supported him in 1912, so he passed a flurry of progressive reforms to gain support and won re-election by a tiny margin, not of 1 vote, but 23 electoral votes. He ran with the slogan, "He's kept us out of war." However, World War I soon pulled America into conflict, and the progressive era eventually ended because the nation focused on World War I instead of domestic reform. So World War I is what brought the progressive era to an end. And we're going to get to that here in just a little bit.